David Fuller, all the way from the UK, and me. And whose show is this? What are we doing right now?
This is the Zubin Demania show. Welcome.
I've always wanted to be introduced by a guy with a beard with a British accent. Like, it's been an aspirational dream of mine for a long time.
I'm told that it's cheating at YouTube to have a British accent. It's too easy. It's playing on cheat mode.
Speaking of cheat mode, your South African accent is a wonder to behold.
I don't want to bring out my South African accent. It's a dangerous road to go down.
Prawns. That's all I know.
Prawns.
Yeah. District 10 we're up to now, I understand. David, welcome. And we're doing a kind of joint show. You came all the way from the UK. You're doing some stuff here in the States. Yeah. Mostly crime. Yeah.
And this is kind of awkwardly poised between an interview and a conversation. Let's try and get the flow.
I know. It's so hard. Yeah. We were talking before this off camera, having this amazing conversation. I met you during the pandemic, and you kind of changed my way of thinking, which not that many people are able to do.
In a good way or a bad way?
Well, that's to be determined. No, in a very good way, because you and I had collided during pandemic around this idea of like, what's going on with making sense of the information ecology in the world. And you were like, oh, do you know about this guy and this guy and this guy and this guy? And, oh, have I told you? Let me send you this. And you opened my eyes to a way of looking at sense making that I had never even, I'd intuited some of it, but
But you already had, so we started connecting around shared interests. So you already had like the Jonathan Haidt moral matrices, and you were using that in your work. You had the integral framing, because when we connected, you kind of said, oh, I saw you in the Ken Wilber interview.
I saw your Ken Wilber interview.
So there was enough kind of overlap, but maybe I had a few more of the kind of up-to-date frameworks that were really useful.
No, a lot more than a few.
I kind of, we've obviously been talking, we've been hanging out for a few days, and really kind of fantastic conversation, but like, let's try and get something on camera that feels like that. And we're both a little bit nervous because we know that as soon as the cameras are rolling, we both experience that often it's a lot more difficult to get that kind of sense of flow. Proviso. But I also feel like, going back to that idea about different frameworks, I feel more like a curator than a lot of the people that I interview on Rebel Wisdom are kind of epistemic authorities on different aspects of kind of sense making or culture. And I consider myself more of a curator, but obviously picking up some of these frameworks and then sharing them. And people like yourself, who I think are observing these phenomena, but maybe don't have the language for it. And then when you find someone who's got the language for it, you're like, I finally understand, or I'm able to articulate it or to process it and make it part of my kind of conceptual framework in a new way. And that, I think, is a feeling that a lot of people have had when they encounter some of these ideas.
Yeah, that's really kind of what it is that you, as the curator, you have these access to these really interesting structural frameworks for ideas that people may intuit, or it's more likely they see it and they go, oh, that's absolutely correct, or that's a big part of what explains why we're either so polarized, or why conspiracies are flourishing during a time of pandemic, or why social media does this or that or the other thing. And what I found with you is, what I love, and again, it's the same thing. It's like the minute the cameras come on, the performance aspect of it becomes an interference pattern in my mind. It's always like, well, what does the audience need to kind of get out of this? And what I want to do is just drop all that crap, because, and let's just see what happens when we just have the same conversation that we have outside for the last few days. But what you have done for me, like, I see my role as less of than the curator role, as the evangelist of ideas that I think are important. So when you introduced me to the idea, even the other day, you were talking about, hey, have you thought about the Enneagram, this personality kind of framework for understanding different types of human personality? And I'm like, oh yeah, I did that years ago. And then you talked me through some things. You recommended a book. I already read like half the book. And then that next day, I go and do a live show, and I'm like, guys, who's done the Enneagram over here? It sounds like crazy stuff, but here's the interesting thing. And I'm evangelizing parts of it that I think are useful for the framework of, again, making sense of the world and ourselves and introspection. So that's where I think we're almost a dynamic duo in that way. So it's been it's been awesome.
Yeah. And it's also, I was reflecting, kind of making a few bullet points about what we might cover, including kind of the history of the pandemic, because interesting, we connected during the pandemic, which was just this incredible, particularly the information landscape and the communication around medical stuff, and then the vaccines and all of that real, like, incredible intensity. But the irony is that the things that we share, the frameworks that we share, which is kind of like new paradigms of thinking around, you particularly around healthcare, you've talked about healthcare 3.0. It's interesting that that's not really been the frame that we've been discussing. And yet that's kind of our shared background, is this system isn't working fundamentally because it's inhuman in some ways. It's not really integrating what it means to be human. It doesn't have a sense of development. It doesn't really have a sense of the sacred, like all of these things that we would kind of have probably aligned on. But suddenly the weight of particularly the vaccine stuff and the medical communication, and like many people kind of going off the deep end in various ways. And I'll kind of talk about some of the frameworks that I find really useful to understand the rise in conspiracy thinking, which was predicted at the beginning of the pandemic by someone like John Beveke. He said this is going to happen. So many of these things were predicted and they did happen. And I think there's some frameworks that I featured, interviews that I've done on Rebel Wisdom that illustrate why that's happened. But it's kind of interesting that, yeah, our shared background kind of got lost in that in some way.
It really did. I think the reason, because I forget whether you'd reached out to me or I reached out to you initially, but typically we're in a space where you're inclined to kind of be very suspicious and skeptical of anybody who wants to do anything. And the minute however we connected, I was already quite familiar with you, seeing especially the Ken Wilber stuff. I'm like, clearly this guy and I align on a lot of things. And it's those things that you pointed out. This idea that we have a reductionist system of everything. Healthcare is just an epiphenomenon of, in the US, it's 20% of our GDP. So it's a huge part of what we do, and it reduces everything to an it. And as a result, that kind of flatland kind of viewpoint, Ken Wilber talks about this. And you interviewed Ken and you talked about a lot of different things in it, but I was like, this is a kindred spirit who sees clearly. And then our mutual connection with Jonathan Haidt and his models of moral taste buds and moral reasoning and the righteous mind and the books he's written about that, again, resonated quite strongly. So I was actually very excited to talk about healthcare in particular with you, and those kind of, and the psychospiritual issues around human development. And then we got hijacked into this, which I think was important. And looking back, I think we did some really, and you taught me so much that it's been a wonderful relationship. But to actually get to meet in person and have these conversations is it's a different level, right? That's one thing I just want, before I forget. Zoom versus this. I mean, how do you feel?
Yeah, there is something that happens in person that cannot be. Zoom makes it more functional. So much of human communication happens in the spaces in between. And Zoom kind of makes it formalizes the connection in a way, obviously with the sort of, that it's a box, but the entire communication, the entire interaction then happens in a very functional way. You may have a little bit of chit-chat at the beginning, a little bit of chit-chat at the end, but I realize that so much of the fuel for Rebel Wisdom and I think the USP, the unique selling point of Rebel Wisdom, I said was the production value, because I was kind of quite pleased that I kind of brought my media training and cameras and good audio.
Looks
and stuff,
great, yeah.
which definitely was part of it. But I was saying this to another person we'd both spoken to, Daniel Schmachtenberger, and he said, no, that's not the USP of Rebel Wisdom. The USP of Rebel Wisdom was curating a particular conversation and telling a story of a particular space, a particular conversation that many people have called the sense-making web or the liminal web, or all of these different people, and then being able to see how those different pieces fit together. That you've got kind of the intellectual kind of galaxy brains, but you also got a place for practice, and you've got a place for developing dialogic skills and listening to what wants to emerge, and that sort of space of what is the cutting edge of the culture, what is the kind of integration that we need to exactly as you said before, like the reductionist way that we tend to do things. You're looking at this in medicine, but with Rebel Wisdom, I'm kind of looking at it in so many different areas of the culture and telling the story of an evolving conversation that is moving on to something else. That since the pandemic, I think a lot of people are much more aware of, because the pandemic was this kind of stress test of the existing system that just showed this isn't working. It's sort of like a near-death experience for so many things, and a pattern interrupter where people are now able to ask like fundamental questions of, actually, we don't have to do things like this. Like fundamental changes to the way that we're doing things are possible at the drop of a hat, and they were kind of imposed from outside because of the pandemic. So there's now an openness, I think, to that conversation that wasn't there in the past. And so, yeah, I think the USP of Rebel Wisdom has been to tell the story of this conversation, of what are the broad parameters of it, who are the people that are involved. And I very much see what you're doing as being very much the medical side of that conversation, asking many similar questions, looking at many of the similar limitations of the worldview. And yeah, why did I go on that rant?
You know, I'm going to answer that for you, because what you're telling me with this is something that I intuitively kind of felt about Rebel Wisdom. And you said you're a curator, you're bringing these conversations, and the pandemic was a stress test that we failed, honestly. And that's definitely true in medicine, but it's true throughout the culture, throughout society, throughout science, throughout technology. We failed. So what's interesting, what I think the other thing you might add to your resume on Rebel Wisdom is connector. So connecting dots and connecting people. So what I would do is I'd watch your show. You'd have BJ Campbell on, who I'd never heard of, because our Venn diagrams would not overlap. Like somebody who writes about, say, guns and different things like that on a blog, it's not going to interface with me, except through Rebel Wisdom. And as a curator that I trust, I would see, oh, he's got this guy on the show. And then you would ping me too and say, this is something you may want to check out, this idea of group minds, hive minds, what BJ calls egregores, these almost supernatural occult thing that instantiates from individual neurons, i.e. us, given a neurotransmitter like, dislike, share, and given an infrastructure of glial neurons called the internet and social media, and what could happen in terms of different group minds that now are opposed to each other but don't even know at the neuron level that they exist. So when I say something that is off message for that group mind, I feel the downward pressure of the group mind, like, I better not say that, because, and whether that manifests as audience capture, where I'm playing to my audience, or whether it manifests as I'm a random person online and I just am in that tribe and I cannot see outside of it. Anyone outside of it is not just other, they're alien, they're evil, they're bad. So those kind of little connections, the BJ Campbell thing, I watch the thing, oh my God, then I read his piece, I'm like, oh, now I have this new terminology, new structure of thinking. It then opens connections. And then when I go on my show, I have whatever moderate influence in the healthcare community, I can share this idea parsed through my own understanding of it. So that's the power of Rebel Wisdom right there. And your particular gift, honestly.
I remember the jumping off point, which was you asked about Zoom and how Zoom. Oh,
yeah, that's right.
And that's interesting because you then brought it onto connection, because that was what I was going to say, is that the USP has been, I thought, the production value. So I really struggled with the transition onto Zoom. I think someone like my friend Peter Lindbergh did much better. He created something called the Stoa, which was much more oriented towards Zoom, towards having these conversations. I wouldn't say that Rebel Wisdom adapted too well to that, because my focus had been on the production value and the in-person interviews. And what I realized is that the kind of relationship building aspect of that was really, really important as well. So cohering that sort of conversation, cohering sort of what felt like a coherent conversation, was partly due to meeting people, to having those kind of offline conversations, the before and after of the interview as much as it was the actual interview itself. So I feel like part of the interruption of the pandemic was that the evolution of that conversation was a little bit interrupted at the same time. And there was that's where I feel like Zoom has really changed it. It's partly into the interaction itself, that it becomes more functional and you don't pick up on the nonverbal cues and you don't have that same sense of flow with the person you're speaking to. But also it felt like a lot of the relationship building aspect of the project was lost in that as well, because everything became functional. It's like, well, why are you having these meetings, rather than the spaces in between. You lose the spaces in between with Zoom, I think.
Okay, there's a lot here, and I just want to put a few points on this from my own standpoint. You and I met via telephone, WhatsApp. We've had phone conversations, which actually are vastly better, in my opinion, than Zoom. And actually, there's data to support this. And this is why. It's a little counterintuitive. When humans when we have an interaction like this, we're picking up, like you said, these nonverbal cues, these subtle eye movements and gestures and body language. We're also listening to the audio of our own voices. And there's a lot of information, like you said, in the pauses, in the spaces in between. And there's a cadence of, we know when we're going to talk. It's not like Zoom where there's that microsecond delay that's a poison to the flow of conversation because you stomp on each other. You don't know when you're supposed to talk. There's awkward silence. So that's one piece. The second piece is the frame is like this. So the body language is usually lost. That's why on my own shot, I've started pushing out the frame more and more to get more of my body language. I couldn't do it on your shot here because I have a different lens on there, but I would if I could because it picks up so much more of the nuance. But on Zoom, our mind is taxed looking at the image, worrying about our own image, having the constant connection eye contact, which is straining. Like normally, you and I'll be, look off and there's a kind of relaxation that occurs. But on Zoom, that disappears. So what they studied was the productivity levels of people who used video with Zoom versus just audio, like a phone call, and in groups. And what they found is they were much more productive if they just used audio. And it's because then all the attentional bandwidth goes to listening. You pick up the audio cadences, the subtleties. You're not getting body language, but you're not having this awkward, stilted thing.
And you're distracted by looking at yourself on Zoom.
That's the worst.
Sometimes, I've turned that off because sometimes I'm realizing, why am I watching myself talk? That's just ridiculous.
It's really artificial.
And your bandwidth has gone at that point.
That's true, because now you're thinking, you know what it is? It's almost like your default mode network, part of your brain that creates self-referential thought is jazzed up so much by seeing your own face that you no longer lose yourself in a conversation.
Yeah.
Literally lose yourself. Yeah.
I think there's some research as well that you trust people less on Zoom.
Yeah.
That there's something about, I can't remember what they said why they said it was, but there was something about that even in the moment when someone says something and you believe them, after the call is over, you start kind of going over it. And because you didn't get some of the nonverbal cues for authenticity, you start questioning what it was that you heard from that person. And it actually acts as a kind of corrosive effect on your level of trust and connection with the person that you've just been speaking to.
I believe it 1,000%. We've done shows, you and I, purely by Zoom. How do you feel? How do you feel after we had those conversations? I'm curious. Immediately after.
I don't know.
I remember feeling uncomfortable. Like, I don't think that was authentically me, to the extent that I knew it wasn't you, but I knew it was Zoom. Like, it felt that way. It was like this kind of formalized structure of give and take. You ask, I speak. You ask, I speak. Now, in the couple days you've been here already, the conversation opens up. Daniel Schmachtenberger, who you introduced me to, another great connecting feature of the Rebel Wisdom, David Fuller Genius. I had a wonderful conversation with him. And the reason it was a reasonable give and take flow was that we spent 2 hours prior getting to know each other and a couple hours after. And that makes all the difference. Like you said, it's that relationship building. Yeah. But so during the pandemic, we have that pulled from us, but yet you managed to make Rebel Wisdom do its thing, even with the Zoom and the split screen and all the other stuff. It worked pretty well. I would watch your pieces and I was quite compelled. The BJ Campbell one was quite important. Anytime you have John Vervaeke on there, it's amazing. Yeah. You introduced me to Peter Limberg and the Stoa. Yeah. And I went down a Stoa hole and learned a ton. One of the most amazing things I saw on the Stoa, actually, I don't think we've talked about this at all, was he did a show on awakening, spiritual awakening, and he had Daniel Ingram and Frank Chang, who is this just loco Taiwanese dude who, like, basically we can talk about second self, but basically put his second self out on the internet through a process where he woke up to a high degree of kind of spiritual realization, and you're there for the ride. And he had him and another guy, and they were talking about awakening, and it was one of the most engaging things I've ever heard. And I didn't even watch the video because it was Zoom. I was listening while I was hiking, and I was like, this is the conversation I would love to have with people. And he pulled it off by Zoom.
Yeah.
It worked quite well. So it's doable. It's just a different kind of medium.
Yeah. And another thing just in defense of Zoom is that I found a lot of facilitators in particular, people who are sort of teaching different dialogue practices, and have been surprised by how much you can actually get done over Zoom. That it is quite, a lot of people were, especially if your job is getting people into a room and getting them to do practices with each other, or teaching more kind of, facilitated or group work type stuff, a lot of people, myself included, felt like that's not going to be possible over Zoom. And yet I think a lot of people have found that it is weirdly possible. You can have very powerful emotional experiences. You can feel very connected to people. You can have real senses of kind of community building. Like the Rebel Wisdom community didn't exist before COVID. We had a few. That's not strictly true. It existed to some degree, but it really came together during COVID. We happened to launch our online course in March 2020. We then started doing weekly, or maybe even more, like two events a week. And it cohered around people connecting with each other. We did a few like free events. We'd always try and kind of hack the relationality piece by putting people into breakout rooms together, or teaching sort of different practices of connection or self-expression, or and that's really been a big part of Rebel Wisdom, is bringing together the practices with the ideas and developing those kind of relations. And I know some people who we, for example, put into a small group together for one of our courses are still meeting 2 years on. We've got an event now at the end of November, which will be the first time that a lot of people have had an opportunity to actually come together and meet in person. So and also there's something about, because we were also doing events in London before the pandemic, and it wasn't quite cohering. It felt like more of an effort. And I wonder whether there was something about the conversation that we were trying to host was too disparate at that point. It wasn't really, there wasn't a critical mass of people in, say, a specific location like London to have a coherent event of people who were kind of drawn by the same ideas, the same attractors. Whereas when it went online, there were enough people there to have a critical mass for the conversation to begin to kind of develop a kind of self-awareness. And that partly, I think, is what Rebel Wisdom achieved. Is it was part of this, not the only thing. There were multiple other podcasts, Peter's work at the Stoa, people like Jim Rutt also kind of mapping out what's been called like the what's next space. There is something about having that conversation, having cohered around many of the people that we've interviewed on Rebel Wisdom. And now, as you know, the project is actually wrapping up, completing in November. And partly it's because I think that job has been done, that self-awareness. The conversation has become aware of itself. The people in the network have become aware of themselves, and it feels time now to step into a different kind of relationship with it.
I think that's really interesting in terms of Zoom as the connector of something that would not have been catalyzed without Zoom. I think about that a lot.
Online, definitely.
Yeah. And
let's not give too much advertising just to Zoom.
Yes. Anything online. I mean, StreamYard, whatever you're using. There's a million.
But there's also an interesting parallel here between so many subcultures were created online. Like this sense of the online world leaking out into the real world has been such a feature of the last 10 years. I mean, the Trump election in particular was the time where it became absolutely clear that there were these sort of subcultures that were trying and succeeding in kind of getting Trump elected. There's wonderful books about kind of, I think that's where the egregore concept came from. It was almost like a memeing Trump into office that was a kind of decentralized, what Jordan Hall has called a kind of nascent, very early decentralized collective intelligence oriented towards, partly as a joke, partly as a kind of like the true believers, but partly as a joke of like, let's see if we can do this. And so in a way, as I'm speaking, I'm kind of thinking there's a parallel in that of it maybe had to cohere online before it can then become something in the real world.
It's almost the incubator. I mean, if you look at January 6th in the United States and the storming of the Capitol, I mean, these were ideas that incubated online, that cohered online, and then spilled into the real world to the point where you could see on the faces of the people there, they were surprised that it wasn't playing out the way that it had incubated in the online space.
And that whole, I remember that was January
6th.
January the 6th, 2021?
21.
Yeah, 21.
Yeah.
So that image of the shaman, the QAnon shaman in the Capitol.
Right.
So I did a series of pieces at that time about exactly that. This was like the return of the irrational. It was, and I see that as being the function of the internet is this sort of like, we had coherence. There was a sort of set of gatekeepers. There was a coherence to the narrative. There were all these ideas that were allowed and were not allowed. And suddenly with the internet, we've got the democratization of information and all of these kind of outgrowths of weird and crazy ideas, some of which were kind of suppressed for a reason, are now kind of evolving everywhere. And what we have to do is we can't gatekeep them out. We actually have to confront them. We have to integrate them. And there was nothing more obvious of the sort of part of it is the irrational, that we had a kind of worldview that suppressed anything that didn't fit in a sort of rationalist secular bubble. And there's nothing more kind of obvious than the Q shaman kind of roaring to his heathen gods in the middle of the Senate of like, we're not in Kansas anymore. It's like we've talked a lot on Rebel Wisdom as well about we are in post-secular times. We are seeing religious phenomenon now everywhere.
Re-emerge.
Usually in a different way, like it's happening through politics. On both sides, you've got kind of, on the right and the left, this new religiosity to politics, and then I just thought it was the perfect symbolic moment of the kind of emergence from this kind of online ecosystem of conspirituality, merged with Trump, merged with MAGA, merged with all these different things. Like the Q shaman himself was like a mix of all of these different internet subcultures or general subcultures that just was then this incredible moment of, in a way, it's kind of like it's sort of similar to 9/11 in its sort of memetic power. And also what it symbolizes. In a way, I think it symbolizes the same thing as 9/11. 9/11 was the same early, like, there are forces of
chaos,
religiosity, irrationality that are emerging into the world and are shaking the foundations that are much more fragile than you realize. And I think January 6th was another version of that with the Q shaman.
Yeah, I think that's spot on. And, I learned a lot from your show too, in terms of this idea of the religious connotations around what's going on in COVID. So and since we've given a little airtime to the Trump side of these things, let's look at the religion on the more left side. So the kind of COVIDian thesis religion of, you're impure if you do not wear a mask. You're unclean if you do not vaccinate, the holy sacrament of the vaccine. And you shall not enter the temple if you do not click these boxes of religious devotion to this idea of safety as the God elevated in the secular pantheon of that way of thinking. And a good place to see that is right here where we are in the San Francisco Bay Area, where people are still wearing masks. You're seeing it, right, David? I mean,
Well, this is fascinating because I feel very lucky because the UK, we never went too far down the real COVIDian extreme route that they did. The most extreme example, I think, is somewhere like Austria or Germany, where they were literally dividing society based on your vaccine status.
Right.
But even just being in the Bay Area for the first time since the pandemic, I'm aware, like I'm struck by how, what's the word? Not supercilious, sanctimonious.
Yes.
The feeling is here. And
you feel it, right? Energetically.
I would have been radicalized far more if I'd been in a place like this rather than in London, where generally I think people kind of were fairly common sense about things. People would generally wear masks to be polite in shops, but there was no kind of insistence. It was like from very early on, it was pretty much up to people to make their own decisions. There was a real sort of negative liberty bias, I'd say, to the UK.
So that's interesting what you say about being radicalized by the environment. So if you notice who came out of this place during the pandemic, the loudest voices of opposition to the COVIDian narrative have been people like Jay Bhattacharya, Stanford, Vinay Prasad, UCSF, myself as more the arbiter of like, hey, let's try to find synthesis here, but really spending quite a bit of my time criticizing a mainstream narrative, probably more than not, except when it came to vaccines for adults, in which case I probably criticized the antithesis narrative quite a bit more. But I think it is this feeling energetically of being a little bit radicalized by the surroundings, and it's a religious sanctimonious energy. It's you're walking into the grocery store, and if you, even though it's no longer the law to wear a mask, if you don't wear one, you are an apostate of some kind, and you feel it. You feel it. People will keep a distance from you, and so on. And of course, I actually happen to know some of the science around this and go, well, this is not helping you, your cloth mask in the setting of Omicron in a widely ventilated grocery store, but it is the religious symbol of maybe it's tribal loyalty, maybe it's a sanctity versus degradation, John Haidt moral palette.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's
or the René Girard's idea of the scapegoat, like all of these things start to come into play, like a deep religious kind of perspective and superstructure.
They're the problem.
They're the problem. Like these are, so John Vervaeke said at the beginning of the pandemic, I remember this distinctly, we did a fantastic interview right at the start where he said we're going to see a huge increase in conspiracy narratives, we're going to see a huge increase in scapegoating, because what happens is with this virus, it puts us into a very Old Testament way of being. These are really old patterns and old triggers because you've got this ever-present threat that is like a kind of Old Testament God. You've got these purity codes that come in. You've got effectively our pattern recognition for threat starts becoming hugely overemphasized. So he predicted that this was going to happen right at the beginning of the pandemic and was absolutely right.
It happened very fast.
It happened very fast.
Yeah, very almost instantly.
Yeah.
Some of our earliest videos before you and I connected were debunking, plandemic conspiracy and this and that, and finding a degree of easy audience capture there, because my pre-existing audience up to that point were, pretty mainstream medical people that were frustrated with medicine, but were still medically conditioned people. And when you have people saying, oh, this thing is a hoax and so on, and a plandemic and all that, it really triggers a certain morality in that tribe. And I shared that at the time, and I was like, yeah, these people, what is wrong with these people? It took the pandemic, the kind of growth of going through that and going, no, there's nothing wrong with them. They're behaving like good human beings. This is like Vervaeke predicted it. This is very predictable based on moral reasoning, religiosity, all the things that both sides, all the camps have. And so if we can speak to that, actually, we might actually influence an actual synthesis discussion. Yeah. Because they're not entirely wrong. They are right to be suspicious about this and this and this and this, and you should question the narrative, and there is no the science and all of that. So that was an evolution for me too, because it was also kind of giving a little sternal rub to my own audience that I've had a lot of people now who are very upset because, you're giving, even by giving the anti-vaxxers an inch, you're opening up. It's like what the National Rifle Association here in America says about any gun regulation is giving them an inch and they'll just take away your guns. And that's what how the pro-vaccine people sometimes feel. Yeah. Yeah.
It's a fascinating, I've seen you go through that journey as well. And there's two things I'll say. One is that we've had an exploration around what is responsible heterodoxy, which is being skeptical about big pharma. Like, of course you should be skeptical of big pharma. Right. And it's a very interesting phenomenon that suddenly the left or the liberal left is the one that's saying, no, you trust big pharma. Absolutely. And it's like, no, Pfizer in particular have been absolute fucking assholes all the way through.
Throughout the whole thing.
Throughout the whole thing. And so it's like, what is responsible heterodoxy? What are the things that should be questioned? And what are the things where it kind of veers off the road into unsubstantiated claims? And why are people only selectively skeptical? So you can kind of go into all the different claims, like, and I think the ones that you're right to be suspicious of, and the ones where it's like, no, you're making claims that just don't add up here. Rather than going into the content, which is where people, I think, start to get lost, and that was inevitable that was going to happen. It was inevitable that there would be a counter narrative, and it was going to be seductive, and there were going to be people who were pushing it. The best thing, I think, is, again, going back to John Vervaeke's work, is don't pay attention to the outcome of your thinking, pay attention to the process of your thinking. Where are you collapsing into narratives? Where are you starting to be suspicious of only one side rather than the other? Where are you able to kind of stop yourself in certain kind of thought patterns or thought spirals? And he talks about something called the Hermeneutics of suspicion, which I think is a really useful framework. But generally, I think it's a mistake. You can talk about Mars, you can talk about ivermectin, you can talk about the vaccines, you can talk about all these things, and you have, and I have to some degree. But I think it's a mistake, because as soon as you do that, you start to get into the weeds, you start to get into specific claims, and I think you start to lose your way, because reality is infinitely complex, and you can kind of find all sorts of reasons either side for believing certain things and not believing others. But surely what we have to do is to come back to, okay, what is the process of my thinking?
Yeah.
How am I behaving? Where am I attaching too much certainty to certain things and not enough certainty to others? Where am I negating like people's motivations rather than kind of looking at the wider picture of, like, as we've talked about, audience capture, of financial drivers, all these different things that I think people, for example, on the antithesis side, the sort of more skeptical side, are very conscious of the financial drivers of big pharma, of media, of kind of the way that they create a certain narrative, but they give a pass to the fact that saying these things like pandemic was hugely popular. It was incredibly popular. That narrative of I'm being suppressed, I'm being censored is hugely popular. I'm the little guy speaking up against the big guy. Those are easily weaponized narratives. And so you get this skepticism on one side that generally gives a pass to the obvious, if you look at it carefully, drivers on the other side.
I think that's absolutely correct. This idea of awakening to our own thought process, being able to actually observe our own thinking rather than just being fundamentally captured by our own mind. And so this is a great example when you see people out there who have kind of, maybe we'll name names, maybe we won't, but there are some public people who host shows on YouTube and other places where they started out very scientific and kind of nuanced, and you can see over the course of the pandemic how they get radicalized into a kind of a bubble of either all vaccines are bad or every child needs to be vaccinated 20 times. And you watch their audience in the comments and they are all radicalized around the same thing. It's clear, like you can look as an observer and go, okay, I know what his YouTube revenue is from ads because I can see the views. I see what ads they're putting on. They're putting on mid-roll ads. I have some experience with that. They're making this. The audience is completely captured. They could never do a video that
and they're not speaking to anyone on the other side, for example.
Not a single person. And that gets into the egregore, like the tribe mind thing. There's no incentive for them to do that. There's not yet a nascent large tribe of people in the tribosphere that is looking that has enough volume that rewards nuance, kind of creating this corpus callosum between the right and the left hemisphere of rewarding a kind of what I've called alt-middle thinking, where it's a synthesis kind of seeking and clean bias, and the things that Peter and others have talked about and you've taught me about, this idea that, when you're debating, it shouldn't be that you're there to win a thing. You're there to find truth, to have a dialectic, to have a conversation, and you put your bias out there in front. What would it take to convince me to change my mind? Put that out there, because if nothing will convince you, then why are we having this debate? It's just a contest.
And you're pointing to the really important thing, which is, and I find that if you go into almost any subject far enough, you end up in the realm of personal growth. You end up in the realm of awakening.
I agree. I agree.
You're having to pay attention to, how am I being hijacked? What are the hooks? Like it requires introspection, and I think it also requires practice. What are your introspective practices? again, not necessarily naming any names, but the people that I'm aware of that have gone down this rabbit hole, I don't see that level of introspection.
Agree.
I don't see that level of introspection. I don't see them reflecting on what are their biases, what are the things that they're not seeing. And I don't see that they have a basis in practice. Like, what are the practices that you're doing? If you're just saying, well, everyone else is captured and you can trust us effectively, either explicitly or implicitly, how do you know?
Yeah.
Like again, John Bevacqua, I think, is one of the key thinkers in this area, because he talks about the very thing that makes us intelligent also leads us to self-deception. Yeah. Because intelligence is about how we find certain things relevant and other things not relevant. It's what he calls relevance realization. And we are incredibly good at bullshitting ourselves and finding certain things particularly interesting and certain things not interesting. And then when we're in this media environment where we are overwhelmed with feedback all the time, it's a natural human thing to just be able to completely frame out anything that challenges our narrative and just take in the thing that is giving us infinite kind of positive feedback.
Stimulus. Yeah. And actually, social media weaponizes that.
And we've seen that with so many of these figures. Like having tracked this kind of conversation of all the different public intellectuals, almost everyone has gone off the rails. Yeah. Like extraordinarily so, up to and including the biggest names. I'm like, wow, the sense-making crisis is deep and it is pervasive. And pretty much COVID, more than anything, I think for the heterodox contrarian space, was a revealing of how pernicious and how all-encompassing the media landscape we've created is, and how easily we can lose our way.
You know,
and if you don't think it can happen to you, then you're absolutely
you're in danger of it. You're in danger of it. Every time we have this conversation, I'm thinking in my head, okay, so how has my evolution been? Is it an evolution I want? Am I captured by my audience? Do I care about this, that, or the other thing? Am I blind? Am I delusional? One of the most powerful things my wife ever did for me, and she's helped me so many times, right? Because I'm an Enneagram 6 and she's an Enneagram 9, which apparently means I don't know what. But she has always been a source of stability for someone who seeks stability. One of the things that when I started this enterprise as my sole thing that I'm doing to make a living, in other words, I can still see patients, but I'm not making money doing that because it's a conflict. I do this. I told her in 2017, look, we're winding down our clinic. I think I want to do this thing. I think I can help change healthcare by catalyzing conversations, by evangelizing things that I think have worked, by showing people bright spots. And I think I can monetize it this way and so on. And she said, okay, so I need to ask you this. Could you be lying to yourself and delusional? Could it be that you think this because you're getting this feedback from people that just happen to like you for whatever reason, and you're just self-deluding? And I stop in my tracks and go, this is absolutely possible, and had to reflect. Now, what we see now, I'm not saying I'm not delusional now, but I do have this practice. Now, when I see the people that you're talking about, I see no self-reflection. I see a dogged kind of blinders on, and the Greeks have been talking about this since antiquity. It's the three aspects of tragedy: hubris, the sort of arrogance that I think I know what's going on. Here I have the answer. Ate, which is blindness, and that's what we're talking about: is this blindness to, oh, could it be another way? Could I be self-deceiving? Is there another answer? Should I be talking to people that disagree with me instead of just sniping at them on Twitter where they're not, they're going to respond in this quantized way? And then nemesis, which is the downfall. Now, we haven't seen a lot of nemesis yet. But I think that's...
Well, I think it's slow burning nemesis, because it's just who's not returning the calls, whereas how is your reputation? Yeah, it's a slow burning thing, I think, in a reputational way. And I think a lot of people's reputations have been severely impacted over the last 2 or 3 years.
I think it's worse in the heterodox space and the antithesis space than it is in the mainstream space, because the culture is still a mainstream centered culture. And so people who have gotten crazy in mainstream are not going to suffer as much reputational damage, I think. But we'll see how it plays out.
Yeah.
Yeah. I would hope they do, honestly. Because
I want to recap on the hermeneutics of suspicion.
Yeah, please tell us about that.
I mentioned that. And
then we moved on,
Yeah, I made a note.
Excellent.
And
science.
I think it's really, really helpful as a framework. So again, this is John Bevacquia's work on our cognitive grammar. I think he took the phrase hermeneutics of suspicion from someone else. But he basically said, so the idea is hermeneutics is how we make sense of the world. What are our kind of pre-existing frameworks? So it's a framework of suspicion. And the idea is that the hermeneutics of suspicion became much more popular earlier in sort of the 20th century with things like Marxism, which said all of this isn't real, it's actually class struggle. Or Freudianism, which is this isn't real, it's the unconscious. Like there is a hidden code to understanding what's going on. And so a lot of these different frameworks became, and postmodernism in a way was really a growth of a lot of these things, like Foucault, sex and power, like all of these things are ultimately it's about this thing, not this thing. And the hermeneutics of suspicion, I would say that there's no better description, especially of American culture right now, of the hermeneutics of suspicion eating itself. Like has become increasingly paranoid, increasingly conspiratorial, where it's like it's not this, it's this. And any statement, anything that is offered is immediately undermined, subverted, or that's not what's really going on. And you see it everywhere. Like you can just go and have a look at the YouTube comments threads, and it's like this is full of shit, this is not real. And John Vervaeke talks about this as like the hermeneutics of suspicion is now the dominant frame in our culture, kind of fed by alternative media, I would say. But what he says, and this is a beautiful insight, he says the hermeneutics of suspicion is ultimately parasitic on the hermeneutics of beauty. What he means by that is you can't have a hermeneutics of suspicion without that aha moment of I know the truth. So, and the hermeneutics of beauty is that aha moment of I see through. This is what's. It's ultimately an insight addiction. So if you think about, you can't, because you have to have somewhere to stand. So the hermeneutics of suspicion ultimately relies on the sense of I know the answer, I know, and that is actually a very addictive thing with the conspiratorial thinking is, oh no, I'm in the know, my sort of small group of people are in the know. And so, and also I just had a brilliant conversation with John Vervaeke and Jonathan Pajot, and he noted that the hermeneutics of beauty is actually how we live most of our lives. We believe that this cup is not going to fall apart. We believe that the world around us is ultimately knowable. And then John talks about, so what are the practices that can develop that hermeneutics of beauty, that kind of that sense of trust, that mutually disclosing insight between people that becomes what he calls dialogos. So the practices that can unfold that sense of trust and shared worldview or shared experience between people that we can then build from the ground up in processes like circling or dialogue practices or any of these kind of ideas. But that the idea of the hermeneutics of suspicion and that being, you then see so many people who follow that spiral downwards into further and further kind of suspicion. Do you find it a useful framework?
It's a great framework, and I'll add to it by saying, so the hermeneutics of suspicion is actualized in an almost perfect way by our interactions on social media, because you don't have the attractor or the facilitator of the hermeneutics of beauty, because you don't have the trust, because these are non-playable characters in your mind. They're enemy opponents.
Facsimiles.
They're facsimiles. They're one-dimensional, and so it's easy to be suspicious of them. It's like what we were saying with Zoom. Like, how did I feel after a Zoom conversation? I feel a little flat and inauthentic and a little off because the nuance isn't there. Now, in the hermeneutics of beauty, just you and I having a conversation, like even if we disagreed strongly on something right now, we would have a sense of, well, I trust this guy is good and he's trying his best to figure out the world. I may disagree and we can argue, but online it would just evolve into that guy's evil or dumb or
But you're right. It's the sort of facsimile world which overlaps with, you're right to bring it back to the kind of everyday interactions that we're having. This is a point that Jonathan Pajot made in the conversation with John, which is, we're surrounded by the hermeneutics of suspicion in every way. If you take Freud as one of the people who kind of invented or created, set the ground for the hermeneutics of suspicion, his nephew, Edward Bernays, went on and created advertising. So he used that insight that was of the unconscious to then create advertising. And we're now surrounded, like the very air that we're breathing, the world that we're living in is created by the hermeneutics of suspicion. We know we're being lied to all the time by pretty much everything around us, and we just take this as the way things are. So of course we're then going to have that suspicion because we're being bullshitted to by everything around us. Like we've created a culture that is where we almost don't even see the lying, or it's more bullshitting. And John Vervaeke again talks about how it's not really lying, it's bullshitting. It's because we know when we watch that commercial, we don't really believe that shampoo is going to
make our hair
doesn't really work with you.
Back hair.
Yeah, but we know that is not going to kind of change our sex lives, or that car is not going to kind of lead us to spiritual oneness. But we kind of believe it anyway, or we're in this sort of weird half-life of knowing we're being bullshitted to, but at the same time accepting it. And so I think that a good conversation is where you're having ideas while you're talking. Yeah. And I'm actually kind of thinking this through for the first time and kind of joining those dots. And it does feel like that will fuel this sense of paranoia, of conspiratorial thinking, because everything about the world that is presenting itself to us is in some ways a lie.
A lie. Well, you had sent me something that kind of made me go, oh shit, because I've seen this in medical sort of misinformation communities where there's a kind of a concrete thinking that happens, an inability to subliminally or unconsciously recognize that we're being bullshitted to and accept that as part of the background. So for example, I think it was something you sent me, it was an article written about how in old Soviet Russia, people knew when the government said harvest is good this year, it meant you're going to starve to death. If they said harvest was amazingly outstanding, glorious harvest for the proletariat, whatever, it meant that it was going to be an average harvest. And so people knew how to parse the standard running lies of the authorities. And people still do the standard running lies. That when the CDC says X, you kind of parse it as Y.
This is Scott Alexander, Slate Star Codex guy, now Slate Astral Codex 10.
Got it.
But so the point that he was making was exactly that a lot of what happens in probably medicine as well, maybe you can speak to whether it happens in medicine, but in journalism, there's a kind of private language.
Right.
And when it comes out of the people, and if you know journalism, and politics is a great example. It's like so many of the arguments in politics are like, well, Prime Minister, will you absolutely condemn? It's like, yes, I think that was terrible. Will you absolutely condemn? And it's like there's a private language or the denial.
Yeah.
Where if you know politics, it sounds like a denial, but he didn't actually say that he didn't do it. So a political reporter will be able to pass these kind of almost like reading the tea leaves of different industries. And if you know what the tea leaves are in those industries, you can actually decode it. And there is a kind of weird truthfulness in there.
Yeah.
But you have to know the code, the language codes.
You need the Rosetta Stone for that particular space.
Yeah, so anyone outside that, it looks like these people are lying all the time. And they kind of are, but they're kind of not.
Right.
There is a private language. And what Scott was saying is that a lot of the suspicion that people have around some of these kind of elite forms of discourse like media or politics is because they don't have the language to pass it. So it just looks like absolute bullshit or lying all the time. But he's saying, no, once you have the private language, and he uses the example of the Soviet harvest, unless they say it's a glorious harvest, they say it's just a good harvest, you better stock up because you're going to starve. But if you were completely naive and you didn't know the rules,
seriously,
you'd be like, oh, it's a good harvest, it's fine. It's like, no, you need to pass the language rules. Is there something similar in
absolutely
medicine?
And in medicine, this is common because we have our own secret language. The way we talk about prognosis in cancer, the way we talk about how sick you really are, the way we talk about what really needs to happen for you. Well, you need to get more active, and that may be euphemistic for you're killing yourself with the junk food you're eating, but I'm too diplomatic to tell you specifically what you're doing. And because there's a part of me that knows that it's not entirely your fault. You live in a food desert. There's social determinants of health. So I'll tell you this. But if you're listening to it from a space of either naivete or concrete thinking or not knowing the language,
or the prognosis for this cancer is good,
which
but
means
that's relative to the fact that 90% of people die from this cancer.
Exactly right.
Yeah.
Yeah. This is the best type of pancreatic cancer you can have. Okay. So you're still going to have to go through hell and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
But people don't know that. And doctors are notoriously bad at communicating that because they're also projecting their own defenses around being honest and, especially around end of life stuff and this kind of thing. So that kind of thing definitely plays out in healthcare. Now you have a pandemic where even Fauci will come out and say something kind of that sounds like bullshitty equivocation, and other doctors will listen to him and go, yeah, that's what I would say if I were standing up there, because it's kind of like, you don't want to commit to this because we know there's uncertainty, but you don't want to let people know you're fully uncertain. So you'll say it this way. But anyone who knows will listen and go, yeah, they don't fucking know what's going on, but they're putting their money on this. So let's see what happens. Yeah. And I think if people really all had that ability, I think the pandemic might have played out a little differently. Or if our elected and public health officials had actually just spoken plain English, it might have been much clearer.
Yeah.
Something I've been advocating for. Just tell the truth.
I mean, I think a lot of people have reflected that public health messaging needs to evolve. Like this pandemic was the first one really that has happened within kind of the social media, alternative media landscape. And clearly there has to be more sophisticated messaging. Yeah. Like you can't just do a one size fits all message and expect it to kind of sustain. And actually you're creating the conditions. Like this is something I've felt for a long time, is that conspiratorial narratives thrive in the gaps between the official narrative and the reality. Yeah. And so all of these kind of little white lies or gray areas will fuel, it's almost like an ecosystem. You're just creating the ecosystem or the growing conditions for more and more esoteric conspiracy narratives by just this little kind of shortcut that you're taking in this messaging, or the way that you're not trusting people to kind of pass this for themselves or whatever. As soon as you try and control the narrative, you create the conditions for the pushback against it. Yeah, I agree. It's fertilizing this territory, and then you have structures, technological structures in place that accentuate all of that, through social media. And then you create again, we were talking about in the beginning of the thing, the incubator for this thing, then it spills into the real world. And what's interesting is it used to be, you didn't hear about this stuff unless you're online and stuff. But now anytime like someone comes to fix your pipe, or you go to the store and you strike up a conversation, these kind of little mini tribal conspiracy spaces become quite evident in the conversation. It's very quick. Someone will say, "Oh, the thing about these masks," or whatever it is, whatever. Pick your poison. And actually, it's actually quite strong on the COVIDian side too. Oh, these Republicans, they want to kill everyone by not letting them vaccinate. Which is the thing that I think people, because on the COVIDian, let's say thesis antithesis side, let's use that terminology. I think, and maybe this is a bias because rebel wisdom has been within the kind of antithesis space, more or less. Yes. Very much the heterodox space from 2018 onwards, because I think there was a really valid and necessary heterodox perspective that was, you're familiar with the Ken Wilber framework, so sort of pre-trans manifestation. Yes. And I think that's the best way of looking at, you had which is a sort of pre-rational sort of an emotional reaction to whatever Hillary Clinton is selling. I don't want it. Yeah. Totally understandable, and but very emotional, very reactive. And within that there were kind of reactionary forces. There was some kind of basket of deplorables involved in that as well, but that wasn't the only reason why people were rejecting Hillary Clinton. Right. So from 2016 onwards, you had like a rejection of a very naive liberal status quo that left out an awful lot of the world and had a moral superiority, and was like, we're a hidden tribalism, sort of like, we're no longer tribal, we're open to everyone from all backgrounds, all sexualities, all races, unless you don't think like us. Right. And so rejected traditionalism, rejected anyone that had sort of a different moral palette around their kind of worldview, and people picked it up and they hated it for good reason, because it was very judgmental, it was very sanctimonious, it was all of these things.
It was self-contradictory too.
Self-contradictory.
Yeah, no hierarchies except for the hierarchy that says there are no hierarchies.
Yeah. And so you had this rejection of the liberal status quo that manifested as a sort of pre-rational rejection. I think Trump and Brexit were very much kind of fueled to a large part by that. And then you had a more integrated, reflective rejection of that perspective that you saw with some of the more the intellectual dark web at its best.
At its best.
So these are the sort of podcasters, public intellectuals at their best, I think, were articulating a rejection of this worldview that was more nuanced and more complete. But over time, because of the nature of the platforms we're using, a lot of them got pulled down into that more reactive space.
Yes.
And I think started becoming much more reactionary. You look at some of the kind of more high-profile members or people within that, and they're now kind of just shouting at people on Twitter and making fools of themselves in various different ways. They got pulled down into the kind of more emotional, more reactionary elements of that. And the irony is, again, coming back to the Ken Wilber model, I think if more of those people had that Ken Wilber model, which is the idea there is a way of understanding the world, an integrative second tier perspective that understands that all of these different value structures have meaning, have a place, are related to each other in kind of in complex ways. We need traditionalism. We also need postmodernism, or a healthy postmodernism. That, I think, is ultimately what they lacked. A lot of these people lacked. There wasn't a real sense of an integration. So it became a reaction to the excesses of postmodernism, the excesses of what Wilber would call like green, multi-perspectival awareness, that then required, and if people are watching have no idea what I'm talking about, the book Trump and a Post-Truth World by Ken Wilber, written in 2017, I still think is probably the best guideline to kind of understanding the cultural landscape.
So understanding, if you have that framework, you can then see where you have the sort of pre-rational age, the sort of blue, like authority, et cetera. Then you have rationality, which was a lot of the 20th century, where we were, celebrating capitalism and merit and that kind of thing, and a kind of a more classic conservatism, like, hey, we're
science and modernism.
Science, modernism, rationality, enlightenment. The Enlightenment era, that kind of thing. Then the postmodern era with, like you said, multiculturalism, so widening circles of compassion, widening acceptance, seeing that some views are constructed in a way that it doesn't make them as absolute. But then,
and the developmental model there is that as you were talking about, science, modernism, which is coded orange in integral theory, spiral dynamics, was it was uni-perspectival. It's like there is a truth, it is science, it is modernity. And then, so there's a developmental pattern here of like how we evolve as well.
Right.
And then when postmodernism came in, the green worldview that came in much more strongly in the 60s, it was there are multiple perspectives. There are more than one perspective, and it's important that this one perspective tended to have biases. It was very male, it was very rationalist, it was very... It put everything into its
maybe
frame.
Reductionist.
And then there are multiple perspectives, and they all need to. And it was a positive development originally, and then it went septic because ultimately it said, and there is no one truth. There is no truth, and yet that is a truth.
Yes,
that's the performative contradiction.
Exactly right.
Yeah,
exactly right. But this is all absolutely necessary parts of human development and societal development. That's what a real Wilberian would say, because you can go, okay, well then is postmodern multiculturalism, is that the final say? Where people are upset now is, I think, when you talk about pre-trans, the pre-people are pre-green meme. They're still either living in orange or in blue, and they're throwing darts at something they see as ridiculous and alien and not to be had. Yeah. But the post-green people are standing in a what may be called integral or teal color. I've called it alt-middle. It's just a new reframing of the same thing. It's looking at it and going, oh, all of this was necessary, but look at the downside of green, that you're seeing the shadow of green. We should criticize that shadow because you want to nudge to the next level, which is this integral level that says, oh, the first tier 2 level, where it's a slightly higher perspective, where it says, yeah, there are all these perspectives, but some are a little more complete. And including all of these as part and necessary, and actually honoring people that are in those levels and trying to nudge them to healthy levels of that level rather than dragging them into another level, which never doesn't really work that well. If you look at immigration, things like that, taking somebody from a pre-rational level into modernity is always a shock. That's what I think you're pointing at with trans. So the IDW at its best was an integral look back at green going, hey guys, look, see, it's finally happening. Green is starting to show its age. Let's start to evolve into this new thing. But what we've seen is a regression back to a pre-state that's weaponized by audience capture and all this other stuff that we've talked about.
Yeah, because so much of the emotionality and the attractive force, once you get particularly because you've got this paradox within the podcasters and public intellectuals that made up the IDW, of they were outside the institutions. Yeah. And if you look at kind of Eric Weinstein in particular talked about the only people who are able to tell the truth now don't have the institutional capture, don't have the fear of being kind of sacked or cancelled. So they are able to speak more openly. And that was what he was saying back in 2018. I think there's some truth to that. But what that didn't factor is the new failure conditions of the alternative. And I'd say that the morality tale of the last kind of 4 years for these public intellectuals and all of us who've been on social media, and I haven't been immune from it either. Like I feel the weight of like the YouTube comments thread, and there are certain things that I'm sure I would have done differently had it not been for that. Like we're all subject to these things, even subconsciously or unconsciously.
Absolutely.
But the morality tale of the last 4 or 5 years has been the failure conditions of the alternative. And audience capture, I think, is the main one. But by definition, these people are outside the institution, so they are much more dependent on their audience, for income, for validation, for status. So in a way, it's kind of inevitable that you're going to end up being warped by that effect. And there's some fabulous. I think the one that I keep pointing people towards is the series on Dave Rubin called Dave Rubin's Battle of Ideas, which is an incredibly detailed, sophisticated account of Rubin's political trajectory from 2016 onwards, where he was genuinely, I think, someone who was on the left and spotting some problems with the left, and how he became more and more kind of his political trajectory of being someone just interested in ideas to being more and more of a kind of right-wing, I won't say demagogue, that's not quite true, but more
amplifier,
of a
writer.
Yeah, more captured by the right as time went on because of these audience dynamics. It's a fabulous series, I think, kind of essential to understand the media landscape as it is. But we saw so many other people go down that same route because the audience was there. The audience had more reactive, more emotionality. It was a much more kind of stronger gravitational force than whatever kind of nascent second tier perspective was there that was able to appreciate the nuance without like being subject to bigotry or reactivity or reactionariness.
Yes,
of various
neologism.
Yeah.
Okay. So a couple things with that I was thinking about as you were talking about it. Wilbur talks about when a new phase emerges, when a new developmental stage emerges, it needs to capture a certain critical mass of population before it tips into the mainstream. And a good example is in the 60s, you have the civil rights movement, Vietnam, all that tipped people to, it was roughly what did they say, 10% of the population, I think, is the tipping point. I forget the exact number. But when 10% is at that level, and let's talk about integral or alt-middle or where we're talking about this nuanced, seeing the perspectives from a trans-rational place. I think in society now, maybe we're at 2%, 3%, 5% integral. And that's not enough to have a critical mass that makes it a mainstream acceptable thing, which is why you can start at an integral level and like the people that you're mentioning, and then realize that your bread is buttered by the levels that are below. And by speaking those languages more clearly, all the audience capture, all the revenue, all the views, all the narcissism, any self-validation you want from your blindness is going to be validated there, not in the alt middle or in the integral. And I think what's interesting in my own experience is my audience is all over the place, but the ones that say we'll subscribe for $5 a month to be a member and then have these conversations with me are passionately integral. And they'll tell you, they're like, you're the first thing that I've seen where I feel like I'm not crazy. People think I'm some mushy centrist, but I'm not. I'm actually passionate about this. I'm passionate about these are my politics, but I see the truth on all the sides and I speak a language that you were speaking. So that's that audience. And it's not big enough yet to be captured by it.
Yeah.
It's really interesting.
Yeah. And it's also, the other factor is that we have these political biases, but they're being weaponized against us by, like, you've got the colonization of inner space by the tech platforms, which is kind of the other part of this, which is why we focus so much on it. Tristan Harris talked about it in The Social Dilemma a lot.
Yep.
And you have to realize, like, which is again why we have to get to why the answer comes back to personal growth, because our psychology is now being weaponized against us very sophisticatedly by these platforms that are feeding all of these biases, all of these kind of negative patterns in ourselves of like tribalism. Like we've got this. Yeah, I think it's best to see it as sort of colonization or hijack, exploiting of inner space, because we've done as much kind of exploiting of the outside world as we can, and now over the last 10, 20 years, we've been exploiting the inner space as much as possible. Attention, attention, the attention economy. Yeah. And I had a really interesting interview with Tristan Harris where he actually said that we have to get back to treating attention as something sacred, which was the first time I've seen him say it in such a way. But
almost religious.
Yeah, I mean, I know that Tristan has his kind of. Yeah, I think he's got kind of a history with some of these kind of practices and sort of sees of awakening, practices of awakening. Yeah. So I think
the dirty secret is a lot of these people do.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, all of them do. I think.
All of
ultimately.
them do. Yeah.
And so that's the first time I've heard him make that link of awakening to. So our hope, I guess, is that it gets so intense that we're forced to awaken. Yeah. Like we're feeling so kind of exploited and manipulated and attacked by these platforms that the only way is out.
It makes me wonder whether this attention hijack is the opposite of mindfulness. It is actually mindlessness. It's saying, I'm going to allow my attention to ride a train of thought to thought to thought that's actually injected by an outside agent, whether it's the tech platform, whether it's these likes and dislikes, whether it's capture as an audience member by a podcaster or whatever it is, and you're no longer present, you're now in this chain of thought. It's the opposite. So the question is, does that cause enough societal chaos and stress internally that the suffering alone causes us to wake up, or is waking up necessary to actually break this cycle? So it's a kind of chicken and egg scenario. I think you have to come at it at both ends. Myself is my own intuition, but it does make you wonder, because why is it that my friend Angelo, who had an awakening in '94 and has talked a lot about this, and he's a doctor and we've done some shows, he is seeing a rapid exponential increase in people who've had awakening type events where they're now like, oh, I thought I was this, but I'm this. And they see the world completely differently. So social media looks silly.
Is that generally, in his experience, is that because they've had traumatic events that have opened them up, or because they've had blissful events that have opened them up?
It's a mix of things. There's plenty of people who've had trauma that it's the gateway. But he's noticing that even spontaneous awakenings in people whose you would look at their kind of karmic circumstances and go, it's just meh. They're waking up, and he doesn't know why, but he's saying it's a real phenomenon. So could it be that as society starts to evolve towards integral, you're seeing this chaos, which will happen. And then that's why, maybe that's part of the reason for the emergence of someone like Jordan Peterson. He spoke right to the thing in us that is looking for that meaning again.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's yeah. So Jordan Peterson was a big part of the origin of Rebel Wisdom, because I kind of saw him in 2017. Just thought, this guy is speaking to something really important, and it's going to go viral, which it did. Looking back, and John Vervaeke has talked about this as well, with Peterson was fueled by the sense of the meaning crisis. I think the deep mythopoetics, the deep kind of religious perspective that he was bringing, or appreciation for the religious perspective that he was bringing, I think was really important. But he kept being dragged down to the political level. Like that was one of, I think, the tragedies of Peterson.
To the pre-level, yeah.
Because that's where all the attention is. That's where the heat is. That's where the kind of reaction is. So I feel like I don't think that was beneficial to him to continue to just go back to that kind of. It's almost it's almost a kind of addictive thing to keep going back to that particular trough. Yeah,
and I'll say the first time I was exposed to Peterson was through mainstream media saying this guy's some conservative loony bin who hates trans people. And I took interest. I was like, really? And then I watched him speak. I may have seen A Glitch in the Matrix, your film, and some other things. And I was like, this guy is pointing directly at truth. He's pointing at the excesses of postmodern green meme, but he's coming at it from a clearly integral perspective. He's actually, he was incorporating meaning and spirituality back into the evolution in a trans-rational way, not a pre-rational way in those early days. And that was a crack in reality that I saw, that I was like, oh, the mainstream
media.
Glitch in
the Matrix?
I might call it a glitch in the Matrix if I were so inclined. That made me think, oh, the mainstream media may not have a monopoly on truth, which I knew already. Yeah. But now I really knew it, right?
This was something I found at the beginning of Rebel Wisdom, was Peterson in particular was a real selection for people who were willing to question the mainstream narrative, because they would hear about this guy, they'd go and look at him and like, this isn't who the media are saying he is. Yeah. I feel over time he has become more and more reactive, and the tragedy for me at least is that he's become more the caricature of himself, certainly on Twitter, than that he was kind of accused of being at the beginning. And I don't think he was for quite a long time. But now he is kind of the old man shouting at clouds on the internet, which is a real shame.
Do you think it's because he was on the front lines of this sort of charge across the trenches into integral, one of the front warriors doing that, and he's going to go down and get knocked back until there's enough momentum? Maybe. Or do you think it's just a more complex, nuanced thing?
I think that under the spotlight of that much attention and that much, he was sort of like, I've called him the one-man lightning rod of the culture war, and trying to conduct that much electricity. And I think there was a sort of slightly messianic tone to a lot of, or prophetic, like I think he did see himself in the kind of tradition of, he said before, like the Old Testament prophets who come along and say your society is out of whack, you're going down the wrong path, which I think he very much was doing. Right.
12 rules for life. Rules for life, the 10 commandments, they're not far off.
Yeah, 2 more.
It's better by 20%. Yeah. You got Moses beat by 20%.
Yeah. And I think he very much had that, like there was a sense of him connected to something bigger than himself. There was a sort of archetypal power to his, the arc of the Peterson phenomenon. I've sort of very much covered the Peterson phenomenon as being distinct from himself. Right. But there was this sense of the return of the repressed, the return of Jung as this, the reality of the collective unconscious, the way it manifests through archetype, the way it manifests through story, the way it manifests through these deep embodied stories of culture, coming into a cultural landscape that was largely formed by the kind of new atheist, rationalist rejection of anything that had kind of spiritual or religious overtones. And that was the force of what he was bringing, was you're crazy if you're ruling out this entire kind of history of human understanding and knowledge in favor of this incredibly thin, rationalist, Enlightenment conception of reason. And so he was coming with the force of all of that kind of that weight of the repressed, I would say.
This is fascinating because, we all go through these phases. Like we recapitulate societal phases and vice versa. I myself went through the journey of being the Sam Harris new atheist, like loved the end of faith, was like finally someone speaking truth, had always been suspicious of organized religion, didn't understand its role in myself or in people in general, and just thought it was a regressive affectation that would we'd out-evolve as we out-tribalized. We got less tribal and so on, farther from the primordial ooze. And it was fascinating. It was Sam Harris who cracked the door to meditation for me, because I'd had experiences where I was like, this is not consistent with atheism or the fact that there is it's all reductionist materialism. And Sam Harris's book Waking Up cracked that for me, but I was still quite conditioned by this atheist worldview, or that sort of rationalist orange worldview. And it was so between Jonathan Haidt, who had a beef with Sam Harris back in the day, and and a lot of it was framed by outsiders as well. See, Haidt is actually saying religion has these positive merits that have to do with the elephant and unconscious stuff and Jungian kind of stuff and things like that. And then Peterson saying the same thing, actually, and then Harris doing a whole app about spirituality. Suddenly you start to feel your own self, for me, this is just my story, evolving into, oh, wait, no. There's this, but there's also this. And Peterson really pointing right at it in a way that you viscerally feel it, like you come to life. His lectures, I think you've said this before to me or to others, his lectures are like a journey, the early ones. You're just like, you feel an opening. It's almost supernatural. Supernatural meaning it's not reduced to, just this idea and this idea. No, there's something that happens, like a good movie or a flow state.
Yeah, some of his former students talked about his lectures as being like a psychedelic experience. And he, even some of his sort of strongest critics at the University of Toronto said, I saw an interview with one of them where the guy said, well, he was a lecturer there and said, I think I've had maybe one student in my life say that my lectures changed their life, whereas something ridiculous like 25% or a third of Peterson's students say that his lectures were life-changing.
It's a frame shift in perception.
Yeah, frame shifting, which you can tell when you... And he had the ability to reflect on his own thought as well in a really powerful way. Which at the time where he was able to say...
It's almost recursive.
Where it was like, this is why my lectures are having the effect that they have, because people say when they listen to me that I'm saying stuff they already knew. Yeah. He's like, that's what archetypes do. That's the power of these archetypal stories, is to arrange things that you already knew and that you can feel them go and arrange themselves within your psyche. And it's like these that's the power of truth in a way, is it has this sense of familiarity as well as the sense of novelty. There's a sort of weird mix of novelty and familiarity.
Yeah, absolutely. You know who had that effect was Joseph Campbell.
Yes.
Had that effect. And if you go back and listen to Bill Moyer's thing with him, which I did recently, it's like, it was in the 80s or something, and it's like it's brand new, and yet it's so primal, so primitive, so connected to some deep truth. You almost feel like it's new wisdom that's just so ancient. It's a very paradoxical thing. And it almost forces you into a kind of awakening path, because you go, oh, the hero's journey is this. And Peterson was doing the same thing. It was kind of like, get the hell out of your chair, go clean up your room. Like, that's just the minimum necessary but not sufficient. Yeah. And then the goal is awakening.
Yeah. And that's, why I feel a sort of sense of, that's what I think Peterson should be doing more of, is something like the power. I think it was The Power of Story, the Bill Moyers. I
think that was right, or The Power of Myth or something.
Maybe one of the two with Joseph Campbell. Like, that's something I would love to see him do, and kind of, because that's what's really fueling him, is that sense of the kind of. And I don't think people necessarily realize like how unusual that was. He was told to stop talking about Jung when he was in academia, because he said people won't take you seriously. But he was obviously deeply passionate about it. He's come out recently and talked about his own psychedelic experiences, which he'd hinted at in the past. But in the recent conversation with Richard Dawkins, he talked about on multiple occasions having 7 grams of dried mushrooms.
Peterson.
Massive heroic doses of mushrooms.
That's amazing. It doesn't surprise me at all. We can talk about that, but it doesn't surprise me at all. And what's interesting is that he had that conversation with Dawkins. So Dawkins had an amazing conversation with Sam Harris where they talked about meditation and psychedelics, and Dawkins has done none of that. Yeah. And Sam took him through a meditation in the podcast, and Dawkins, when they're done, he's like, I just don't get it. I don't see it's just boring. My thoughts were racing, etc. And it made me think, again, when we talk about, let me just fix this thing that I broke. There we go. When we talk about these kind of people that are these kind of archetypal agents of phase-shifting thought, almost all of them have had either some spiritual awakening or a series of psychedelic experiences. Jonathan Haidt talks about this. Yeah, actually, it was something that we were emailing back and forth about, and he's publicly talked about this. That it was a huge part of his own shifting consciousness was his experience when he was young with psychedelics. Have you had a lot of that experience yourself?
Yeah. It's interesting just reflecting on the two things that I'm seeing. So now psychedelics is kind of everywhere. Yeah. I mean, it's huge.
It's almost pop culture. Yeah.
Yeah. It's become, I've been covering the kind of return of psychedelic medicine since about 2008. I did a story about the first presentation of psychedelic medicine to the Royal College of Psychiatrists in the UK, which was actually an MDMA study, Michael Mithoever's MDMA study. And I was the first TV journalist to be following it, and I've always been interested in psychedelic medicine in particular as what is it about, because it challenges the current medical paradigm. Yeah, it really fundamentally because it's what is the psyche? Yeah, what is the natural healer? Why is a psychedelic experience, a transcendent psychedelic experience in itself healing? Yeah. This is, and the effect that it's had on alcoholism, the effect that it's had on autism. There's the effect now, they're doing all sorts of trials that were happening in up until the 1950s, 1960s, then went underground. And now it's a huge growth area returning to the psychedelic medicine conversation. And I also look at lots of the most prominent people within culture now. Psychedelics is a huge common factor. Yeah, common factor, yeah. Particularly in sort of the kind of public intellectual space. Also, a lot of people doing jiu-jitsu as well, which is interesting.
Brazilian jiu-jitsu. Yeah, I've noticed that too. Sam Harris talks about that a lot.
Yeah, Sam Harris, Joe Rogan, Russell Brand.
Enough reason not to do it. Yeah. Too many intellectuals start talking about it. You just want to avoid it.
Well, it also shows that there is something about the way we're showing. There's a deep interrelatedness between our physical practices and the way that we show up in the world. And you can think about why that is. And I think that's what makes Joe Rogan, for example, a much better interviewer than someone like Dave Rubin, as he's been punched in the face multiple times. And you just get the sense of there's nothing that's going to phase him because of his physicality and the fact that he's kind of he's gone through the process of being
he's embodied.
Yes, he's embodied. Exactly. There's a sense of Joe Rogan as that embodied person because of that, I think.
No one would ever accuse Joe Rogan of being a head, a brain, and a vat. Yeah. That would not work as Joe Rogan. Joe Rogan is this mind-body continuum. Yeah. And he embodies it there. His body language is when he was talking to, I think I saw a piece with Eric Weinstein talking about some controversy that he'd had, and he's just like, hey, well, tell me about this. And look what's going on. And his mannerisms and everything, he embodies what he's energetically communicating. And that's powerful. And Joe's done.
And he also talks about psychedelics.
He's done a lot of DMT. Yeah.
Well, also that he reflected on one of his DMT experiences relatively recently, where he said that he had the experience of being laughed at, that he did the DMT, and he just had this image of all these kind of entities in Joker hats looking at him, pointing and laughing. And he was like, oh, actually, no, that's exactly. And then he realized, like, oh, stop taking myself so seriously.
Yeah.
And so it seems to have a
therapeutic growth
therapeutic
effect.
kind of ego. What's the word?
Disrupting or loosening.
Ego limiting. Effect.
Limiting. That's good. Yeah. My experience with psychedelics is that it takes the ego. It's almost like an energetic process. It's not a thing, and it just goes. And while it's disrupted and open, there's a lot of stuff that can happen.
Yeah.
And before it closes, part of the integration is trying to see what you can change.
Yeah.
So when it closes again, because it will close again, you know, this idea that somehow doing some psychedelics is going to magically permanently fix all your problems is crazy talk. And there's a lot of downside, which we can talk about. But
I'm increasingly. I've always been quite wary because I've had very powerful experience with psychedelics, but I've also, when I did them at university in particular, I had incredible transformational experiences, and then just started trying to chase that high. And what I find is that you get a couple of freebies, and then you start coming up more and more against those limitations in yourself
that you haven't worked out.
You haven't worked
you haven't
through.
Done
It's like you've got to do the work.
You have to do the work.
And I've also, so I originally met my co-founder Ali at the Breaking Convention psychedelic conference in the UK, and I've been in and around that kind of culture for a while. My sense is that far too many people within psychedelic culture fetishize that state, fetishize that experience, and don't do the work to try and live more from that place. And so I've been pushing them more and more towards some of the really good, deep transformational work that I'm familiar with, stuff like Path of Love or the Essence work, where you learn to live, like learn more about your own kind of psychology, learn what are the limiting patterns, and how do you, because what's peculiar to me is that going back to someone like Aldous Huxley, who's kind of one of the fathers of the psychedelic, who wrote the Doors of Perception, and even that the title of that book was "If the Doors of Perception were cleansed, everything would appear to man as it truly is, infinite," which is William Blake poem. So, and he talked about there, like, that the psychedelics were removing the limiting filter of the mind. That effectively our current waking consciousness is like a reducing valve for what's really happening. Therefore, if you know that, then surely you should be looking to do the work outside purely the psychedelic to clean those filters. Or to try and at least understand what it is about our current waking consciousness that stops us from having more capacity, from more awareness. And often they're to do with our conditioning, they're to do with our upbringing, they're to do with our limiting beliefs. And more and more I'm interested in the sort of therapeutic modalities rather than the psychedelics, because I feel like it's more difficult to integrate that psychedelic space. It's too overwhelming an experience sometimes.
I agree 100%. I think in those communities that are very fixated.
I'm tripping balls right now.
Me
just
too.
To let everyone know.
I see three of you and they're all like tie-dyed. There's a lot there can be a lot of magical thinking. There can be a lot of weirdly reification of the ego structures and personality
Psychedelic
structures.
narcissism is a real thing.
Real thing.
It's a terrifying thing as well.
It's almost like addiction to spiritual bypass that comes from the psychedelic experience. Like, I can just escape into this.
Well, it's having a vision. It's like Jung talked about the self and the self, or the self and the ego. Self with a capital S, which is the greater our potentiality and that sense of a larger, more, a dimension of being that we can tap into. But when the ego tries to make it about us, I am that thing, that becomes, we basically crystallize the ego around the experience. And that's where psychedelic narcissism comes from, where the ego makes this kind of sense of transcendence and potentiality into a personal egoic story. And it's dangerous.
And to be fair, you can get the spiritual ego from being a advanced meditator, from going on multiple retreats.
They're the fucking worst, actually.
They are the worst. Well, I am so awake that I don't use the word I anymore because there's no self. So it's this body mind.
David is no longer present. It can only be done in a Californian accent.
Yes, you have to do it that way. You could also do it in a New Zealand accent, like Jermaine and Britt.
Jermaine and Britt.
Present.
Jermaine is no longer present.
He's not present?
He's no longer present.
God, your accents are disturbingly, to my American ears, quite good.
But there's one other thing I wanted to say to that. Oh, yeah. Why I think the meditative, I'm kind of being a little bit flippant saying meditation is the worst, but genuinely I think it's another dangerous path because it's a epistemic closure. It's a very closed worldview because it's one path of awakening for sure, like meditate until things dissolve. But the problem is you also need the therapeutic side. You need to work through, you need to look at your relationality with others. You need to look at all of these things. The problem with if you become too deep in the meditative world is that it's a self-enclosed bubble where it says that, no, you don't need to work on your stuff. You just need to sit with it until it dissolves. You can start questioning and undermining even the need to do that kind of work.
Yep.
And I've seen that so often with experienced meditators where they refuse or reject or will not go into the necessary relational work because they think they've got a kind of universal solvent for that. Meditation can be sold as a universal solvent, and it's not. There's multiple levels and layers of development that we need to deal with at each time, and different practices work on different elements of that.
There's a point of view that's taken by some meditators, and I find myself drawn to this, and I have to recognize it and stop. It's a kind of a point of view that there is no ego, that there is no personality, that this is an appearance out of...
Who is asking that question?
Yeah, who's asking the question? Who needs to fix themselves? Who needs to do the work? Look for that who. And when you see through that there's no who and that it's all this, then you'll see the silliness of your pursuit. Now, the best teachers are the ones who say, yeah, you wake up, you also grow up across these lines of development. Again,
there's a partial truth in that. But it's only a partial truth.
It's partial, exactly.
Yeah.
Like, sure, you can inhabit unbound, contentless awareness, and it will feel like there is absolutely no self, and everything is perfect as it is. And then 5 seconds later, when you're back in your body yelling at your kids, you'll realize how irrelevant that is to actually being good in the world. And there's a saying, I forget who said this, but they said, if you want to know whether you're, have a spiritual ego or you're trying spiritual bypass or whatever, just talk to your friends and see what they say about you. And listen.
Or go and spend time with your parents.
If you spend time with your parents for a week, it'll disabuse you of any awakening, any enlightenment that you think you have, any liberation. Yeah, it's exactly right.
Yeah, it's a deep spiritual truth, I guess. I believe that those two things are true at the same time. There is a truth that this moment is exactly as it is. Perfect. And at the same time, you maybe need the stuff that you need to do. You maybe need to set a boundary. Maybe you need to kind of look at the way that you're treating your kids. Maybe you need to look at the way that, like, all of those things can be true at the same time. And the problem is when you confuse those levels, particularly having looked at sort of cult dynamics, there's a real danger because people can gaslight themselves into, well, no, I invited that into my life.
Yeah.
And there's some way that can be true, that you were naive and you did let that person take advantage of you. But maybe the thing you need to do right now is to set a boundary. Maybe it's to take that person to court. Maybe it's to, and I've covered in particular one cult that I was looking into for quite a long time and looking at doing a documentary on, and I found this pattern so many times with the people who'd gone through it, where they were made to question their own reality in such a way that meant that there was no growth and no accountability within that whole dynamic. And they would just effectively kind of gaslight themselves into I created that reality.
Absolutely. Easy. It's easy.
Yeah.
And that's why when you were saying meditators are the worst, you're not really joking there. What you're saying is this is a scenario that sets itself up as a failure condition to actually encourage this. And Sam Harris and others have talked about this quite a bit. The conditions where you end up with a guy, an Andrew Cohen or someone who's really like, you're like, wow, like this person's highly realized and incredibly abusive, or, an alcoholic or whatever it is, where you would think, well, if the universal solvent of divine being is actually that good, why would these things happen? Because both are true like you said, and both are manifestations of this of reality.
Yeah.
So you have to do that work. That's why I think, you know, something like an ayahuasca journey or something can be interesting, because it can force open the doors where you have to confront some of this stuff in a way that isn't the transcendent bypass of.
I've seen a lot of people in that situation. The ayahuasca is the thing that's opened them up.
Yeah.
Because I think, I don't know why, is it because it boosts the kind of, you can't ignore the emotional reality. Whereas I think with meditation, you can actually end up ignoring the emotional reality.
Yeah. You can let it go.
Yeah.
Now, the best teachings I've heard are saying when emotion arises, dive into it. Dive into it, see where it's coming from. Don't try to think about it, but just feel it raw, because the emotion wants to express. But others are like, oh, it's just another passing cloud, let it go.
There's no meaning to it.
There's no meaning.
It can be
at all.
nihilistic as well.
Yeah, it can. In fact, I think, you know, we were just talking about the movie Everything Everywhere All at Once, this nihilistic bagel that they talk about, where if everything's possible and nothing is real, then what matters? Right. But the truth is, you can find deep, and ayahuasca is one of those that does do that. It's almost, you know, we were talking offline about this. It's a feminine kind of energy that forces you to feel things that can be very uncomfortable, but they can also be quite revelatory and give you insight when you go back into the world. And if you embody that, it's also a very embodied kind of experience where you feel the physicality of it. And, you know, I had done one of these journeys a few years ago, and it was transformative. And for the 4 weeks after the journey, when I would talk to anyone who would listen to me about it, because I wanted to integrate it while I was still open. It was a lot of body language. Like when I would talk, I would speak with hands, and it felt embodied. So it's a very unique kind of thing. But again, I don't say go out and recreationally go do these things. It's part, you have a guide, and it's part of you go with this intent and a certain setting. And
I mean, that is something I think is really good about ayahuasca, is it's still often framed within that kind of ceremonial context.
Exactly.
It's very, whereas LSD or some of the other psychedelics have
drop it and go.
So certainly in the UK, there was sort of a culture of very hedonistic culture around psychedelics that I think is kind of unhelpful.
Yeah.
Whereas ayahuasca, where it is offered, still has that sort of shamanic space holding context. And again, there's better and worse shamans. There's some horror stories around that as well.
I can't imagine. Yeah.
But there is, I think, recovering that sense of ceremony, that sense of set and setting, that sense of the environment that you do. The environment of the experience is going to be fundamental to your experience. So don't drop it at a party.
Right.
Don't take acid at a party and then try and confront your kind of trauma of your parental upbringing in the middle of a kind of dance floor. It's probably not a great idea.
It's probably not the best idea. It gets back to Peterson's strengths, where he's pointing out the meaning component, the archetype component, the Jungian components of this. Like a good ayahuasca ceremony, like you are going in with this intent of there's going to be unconscious stuff that's coming out, and all this medicine does is shows you your own unconscious, and it's bringing it out. And yeah, you can say, oh, there's this mama ayahuasca, and you know the entities that are trying to help you, and whatever your belief around it is, the experience of it is you're seeing things about yourself, and you're shown this mirror, and then you decide how you're going to integrate it. And that sense of meaning, the sense of kind of, you know, and again, the ceremonial aspects of it add a lot to that sense of meaning that I think we've stripped away. I think that was part of probably the reason that the 60s kind of failed as a psychedelic renaissance in that way, is all the trappings of ceremony were taken away, and it became this kind of thing that you're talking about in the UK now, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. The lack of ritual is a big thing in the culture.
It really is. I forget if Haidt talks a lot about ritual, but I forget who was really focused on ritual as a thing, but it is crucially important. So let's see. We've talked about a lot of stuff now. We're coming up on 2 hours. What else have we? What stone have we not? I mean, there's a million. Or are you?
Let's see. Second selfing we haven't really touched.
Oh, wow! The second self.
Second self.
So we were just talking about how the first self can be seen through as a type of illusion, yet has truth to it. It's an aspect of reality. It's a lens through which we experience through this experiences. But the second self is something, Peter Lindbergh, that you turned me on to. That maybe describe it for us.
Yeah. So Peter has an uncanny ability to, we say he's got good coinage game, which in itself is good coinage game.
Yes, it is. It's very meta.
I think he came up with that as well.
Very meta.
So
oh my God.
Peter has the ability to name and come up with really good frameworks for certain dynamics that really help kind of illustrate what's going on. I think he's one of the most interesting thinkers along those lines. The other framework I think that's really important for people to get is his Memetic tribes.
Oh, it's a crucial
piece.
One. Yeah, when you sent me that, it was a game changer.
Yeah. Like I genuinely believe that he wrote that in, I think, 2018.
Right.
And he intended it as a kind of psychoactive piece because it talked about he talked about Culture War 2.0, how Culture War 1.0 was basically left versus right. It was split along sort of the classic kind of lines that were established in the 50s around 50s and 60s around kind of abortion and the classic left-right dynamic.
Gay marriage.
Yeah. And how what we now have is a multipolar war where some of the most intense conflicts are actually on theoretically the same side. And you can look at that very easily, like the never Trump Republicans versus the Trump Republicans, or on the left, the kind of
social justice warriors,
warriors, or around the trans issue where you've got kind of the TERFs, supposed TERFs,
trans exclusionary
radical feminists versus the kind of trans rights activists. Like this is where the most heat in the culture now is, I think, around some of these other dynamics that are not strictly left versus right.
Right.
And he then came up with all of these different tribes and said these are the active agents in the Memetic landscape right now.
Right.
And came up with, I'm not sure how many there were at the time.
There were a lot. Yeah.
Yeah, maybe 18 or so.
Right.
I've got in my mind, but he intended it to be, okay, so each of these tribes has a specific goal. They have a specific kind of prime movers within it, like the chieftains of the tribe. They have specific fears. There's a whole like constellation around them that they have a kind of telos, a direction, and a fear of what they're scared about, what they're trying to achieve. Very brilliant piece that I think you have. It's almost a formation piece. You can't. I think you have to
start with that.
It's a structure that I think you need to integrate to actually understand what's going on at a deeper level. And it had that kind of effect on an awful lot of people, I think, when they read it.
Yeah, especially when you recognize your own tribe in there and you go,
yes, that's why it's psychoactive. He said, because if you recognize your own tribe, it pops you out of merely being part of the landscape and seeing that there's a perspective.
Tier 2.
Like we talked about earlier about the idea of like how do you give people an experience of seeing that there is a meta perspective, or that there is a way of seeing things from the sort of top level of the operating system rather than being lost in one of the apps, effectively, is another way of looking at it. Yeah,
that's right.
Yeah.
In a way, a lot of spiritual practice is that meta level of observing your own mind from a meta perspective, from the integral tier 2 perspective, from the Memetic tribe piece. He laid it out. He goes, here are the tribes. But before that, he set it up in a way that I thought was brilliant. He said, why do we even have the fractured information economy and Memetic tribes that we have now? It's because of these crises that have happened. Number one, the meaning crisis, which we got with Jordan Peterson. We were talking earlier, we were talking about this idea that we've lost the central sources of mythology and meaning that have often tied societies together, with no value judgment on the nature of that myth, but it was a common shared reality that we could say, well, that goes away in the post sort of rational, secular, fragmented internet world. Then you have the, let's see, what are the crises? A proximity crisis, where you are now put next to online ideas that would have been separated by hundreds of miles or thousands of miles. And the statement, good neighbors are made by good fences, applies to that. Now you're pushed up against ideas that really are abhorrent to your own moral sense, and you have to fight because you're there. Then you have the addiction crisis, which is social media itself hijacking our dopamine and our limbic system to try to get us hooked into the social media world where we do score dopamine hits for fighting other tribes. Then you have the the weaponization or the conflict crisis where state actors are actually using these tools to control and manipulate populations, whether it's Russians and Americans doing these things. And then there was another crisis, which I'm forgetting, but there are a lot of crises.
There was one crisis about that involved Beatles having sex with beer bottles. I remember that one.
Yes, and that yes, that was the
sort of like a salience crisis.
It was a salience crisis.
Yeah.
That example, it's an Australian beetle that almost went extinct because Aussies love their beer to look
stubbies.
Stubbies. It looks like the butt of the female beetle. And these beetles saw the world through this interface that was tuned. So I interviewed Donald Hoffman about the nature of reality and do we see reality as it is? And he used this same example. He said, the interface of this insect is they're not tuned to see reality. They're tuned to see fitness payoffs, what helps them survive. And so the stubbies were
super stimuli.
Super stimuli. So that's where it was the simulation crisis or something, or it might have been part of the addiction crisis.
Super stimuli crisis. We've created a world of super stimulus, basically.
Right. Yeah. Which hacks our interface.
Yeah.
So now kids can watch porn that's easily available, and then when they have an actual sexual relationship, they're like, "What is this? This is flat and it's not what I." And I've already hacked into like every possible dopamine response I can get from imagery. And this imagery is not doing the things on the TV.
Yeah.
So this all collides then to fracture us into the Memetic tribes that then go to war. And each of them feels it's existential. Like it's the end times if we don't win.
Yeah. And then he raised the idea of the Memetic mediator, or Memetic mediation being the central role that we need to defuse the culture war. Which is very interesting. That's right, because then he talked about things like clean bias and having debates that are aimed at truth, and the Memetic mediator, which has not emerged yet. He's done a few experiments around that, and the idea of the anti-debate, which is a debate or a dialogue that's aimed towards increasing connection, increasing understanding, rather than winning. Right. So this is a project that's kind of being done at the moment, is how do you trial genuine exchange of ideas that is not oriented towards one person being right and the other person being wrong. How do you get somewhere new together? And this is interesting because I don't know how much of this is personality. There are certain personality types that really value being right. So that's a deep value. My personality type is more like, you're relying on others to help you understand, and you don't trust yourself, and so on. But this idea that Haidt calls it in his book, The Happiness Hypothesis, he calls it a sense of moral elevation. So when you see something that's so amazingly good, like you're like that, you feel it's like an expansion sense. I get that sense when I see opposing views come to an understanding, like do a synthesis where they're not fighting each other. Nobody's winning. It's just, oh, whoa, we've evolved something new. I get a sense of moral elevation. Now, the question is that unique to a particular personality type, or can we start conditioning that into people where that's the dopamine boost? Well, then you've set up conditions for success in terms of reconciliation. This is a question that I've wrestled with a little bit as well. It's like, is it possible for nuance to give us the same kind of hit of dopamine as we get from tribalism right now? And I think there is. I think I look at the communities of people that have coalesced around some of these ideas, and that's what they get excited by, the kind of integration. And so it's about creating enough attractors. Partly it's because we also need to create a hierarchy or a status hierarchy around this as well, because we're such status-seeking creatures. And that's a deep wiring, is that at the moment the status is assigned to those who win the debates, or to those who are kind of like best people in a kind of like dog-eat-dog dynamic. So how do we create status hierarchies or ecosystems that are valuing different things? So that's a really key part of it as well, is like that certain status is assigned to people who are able to hold multiple perspectives, or are able to kind of mediate between different tribes, or to do things in a different way. And that attractor, it's like, how do you make this stuff cool at the end of the day? Like this is something I think ultimately we need to crack.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we will, because I think the conversation, like, this is something I've always wrestled with. How do you make personal growth stuff cool?
Right.
And I think you can do that. Like, if you have, for example, at the moment, what's cool in an environment like, say, the one that Joe Rogan is in, it's like kind of being physical prowess,
dumping in an ice bath.
Dumping in an ice bath,
which is personal growth.
Yeah. How can you then sort of say, well, you think you think you're hard. Have you done shadow work? Have you really confronted your demons?
Right.
And I think there's some element of that in a way with the valuing of psychedelics, the valuing of ayahuasca, the valuing of DMT. Like, you've got to get over your egoic patterns. So I think there is a movement already towards more than just being a jock. It's like, how can you make valuable and aspirational the self growth and the process of awakening. I think it's kind of happening already. Like, if you're paying attention
to the culture,
it's already,
you're seeing it.
And I think we're at a potentially an inflection point post-pandemic where that becomes much more widespread, because so many more people are asking those questions now about meaning, about purpose, which is where we began the conversation, which is quite nice.
Yeah, and I think, if I'm reading between the lines, what I feel is it's a bigger problem for men, in that they are less open. They're more skeptical. This is new age woo-woo garbage, whatever. And then Rogan is jumping in an ice bath. He's talking about his DMT. He's, so at least that's starting to normalize some aspects of that, the more masculine aspects of, I'm going to go in an ice bath.
Or Wim Hof is another perfect
cool
example of someone who's basically doing an incredible job of making spiritual practice relevant to men by connecting it to things that men care about.
He's crushing it. I know a lot of very archetypal masculine emergency physician males who love Wim Hof. Like, it's their gateway drug to awakening.
Yeah.
And what's interesting, it's the emergency people that are the most like, hey man, I heard about this meditation retreat. Like, bro, you're silent for 21 days, bro. Like, that's the warrior's path.
Hardcore.
That's hardcore, man. Your American accent pretty good too. And so there is a crack there, and then they come back and they're like, man, I've been so egoically bound to this anger that I've never let go about my mom and whatever it is. And you're like, dude, that turned quick from like a bro fest to like just total vulnerability. And that's the magic. That's the Trojan horse almost. Yeah.
Yeah. This feels like a nice completion, because it's where we began.
It's where we began, yeah.
And I think it's important. I feel like there is a window for opportunity for those of us who are interested in awakening and all of these questions of purpose, of personal growth. Post-pandemic, I'm hearing a lot of my friends who are doing this kind of work, especially even at like big corporates, are now realizing there's a new openness to it. Partly weirdly contingent is the fact that because of Zoom, the barrier between work and home has dissolved.
Yeah.
So people are now like, it's not anymore just doing personal growth to be better at work. It's personal growth, like the workshops that they're offering to some of these big corporates are about every aspect of your life, because you're the same person at home that you are at work, and the dividing line is no longer there in the same way. So it feels like a window of opportunity right now that I'm really interested in whatever comes next for me personally after Rebel Wisdom. There's a few sort of personal growth oriented projects that I'm really interested in starting up in the UK in particular, because I think we've always been very suspicious of personal growth stuff in the UK. A few different kind of
stiff
reasons.
upper lips.
There's a fear of, there's a taboo around privacy. Which has manifested as a sort of island nation. We've always been much less kind of emotionally coherent and emotionally vulnerable than the Americans. I mean,
yeah, we're a problem.
Yeah, can you please stop bleeding all over me? Sort of thing. But also, there's also a taboo against earnestness, which is something that there's an amazing book called Watching the English by a woman called Kate Fox, where she talks about this, that we will always subvert things with humor.
That sounds familiar.
You cannot take yourself too seriously, which is a fantastic thing because it stopped us, I think, going down like the kind of extremism path.
Yeah.
Extremists don't get very far in the UK. As George Orwell said, if the Nazis tried kind of goose stepping around London, everyone would laugh at them.
Laugh them out of the place. Yeah.
Like that's a real positive, is that kind of subverting everything through humor that we do in the UK.
Yeah.
But it's not very good when it comes to personal growth, where you have to mean it.
Yeah, you have to
really mean it.
Yeah.
It's like in a kind of, and the British find that incredibly intense. If we were doing like a kind of relational practice where I was kind of working with you, or we're talking about our parents or our upbringing or whatever, I'd find it deeply uncomfortable and be wanting to joke about it non-stop. To kind of subvert the intensity. Maybe you're British.
Yeah, I might be, because I've had that. I've been complained about by others that I'm that way. Yeah.
But so there's this taboo around earnestness, and there's this taboo around privacy that I think has stopped us. The personal growth angle, personal growth, no one's ever created an aspirational personal growth brand in the UK. I think for those reasons. And so where it has appeared in the UK, it's appeared in places like Findhorn, or places like Osho Leela, which some people may be familiar with. It's new age. It's a new age aesthetic. It's not aspirational. If you're kind of like not already in that kind of world, you go there and you're like, it's not really my tribe. Even though I'm attracted to it for these reasons or these reasons, it's never really landed. So I think there's a real opportunity for something new in the UK. And I think if and I'd love to be part of this. I'm kind of already in conversation with a few people about kind of creating a more aspirational personal growth brand, for want of a better word, in the UK. I feel like if we can crack it for the UK, make it cool and aspirational for the UK, it's got an opportunity to be that for elsewhere, because the UK is a very
if you can do it there, you can do it anywhere.
Kind of.
Yeah. Well, okay, if you do that, first of all, congratulations on being a cult leader. I approve highly. Second, I want to be your celebrity spokesperson. And I'm only a celebrity in medical circles. So you'll end up with a bunch of ER bros who'll be like, bro, I love this brand, man. Lulu Fuller, meditation and personal growth.
Dave Hoff.
Dave Hoff. That's even better. That's even better. Well, you know what? I got to say this. If anybody's going to be a part of that I'd want to see be a part of that, it's you. That I've gotten to know you over these last couple of days. I have to say, like, I am really impressed with your own passion and dedication to personal growth, even though it's hard. And again, as a Brit, it's probably even harder.
Do you know how deeply uncomfortable hearing this makes
yes,
me feel?
I know. That's why I'm doing it. Because since you, part of my personality is to drive a wedge in people's weaknesses when I finally detect them, and I finally detected yours. So now, joking aside, I mean, you've taught me an immense amount. You continue to teach me. You teach your audience. The Rebel Wisdom arc has been a gift to all of us that are trying to make sense of the world and grow and have this integral perspective. And so it was really great to be able to sit and talk for how many hours now? 2 and some. Yeah.
And if anyone's still watching this, then congratulations.
Congrats.
And I want to say how much I've valued connecting with you since we first connected. I mean, there's been, I saw the first thing I saw of yours was the piece where you just called out the medical community during COVID. It was this needs to end now. And I was like, whoa, who is this guy?
Yeah.
And then I can't remember how we got put in contact, but immediately I was like, yeah. And there's something, what I find really fascinating is I've realized the longer I've been doing this, it's actually a relatively small world. When I've really connected with someone, it's happened like 3 or 4 times now where I've been like, I love what that guy is doing, or I love what that person is doing. And I'll contact them and they're like, I love what you're doing. Yeah. And that's happened with the person who wrote my favorite song, Alex Ebert.
Wow.
I connected with him. Like, I love his song Truth. I think it's the best account of awakening there is anywhere.
I haven't heard this.
It's incredible. And he I've been admiring his work for ages. I got in contact with him and he's like, dude, I love your work. And with my favorite musicians, same thing. With my hero from my musical hero growing up, Tim Booth of James, who's got the same haircut as you. Turns out when I connected with him, he wasn't actually aware of Rebel Wisdom, but as soon as I connected with him, it's just like total kind of bro love.
So you're telling me there's hope that if I reach out to Weird Al, he'll actually know who I am?
Yeah, he definitely knows who you are. I think he's already got a restraining order against you.
Yeah,
so,
he might.
Yeah,
I keep sending him ideas. Don't you love it when that happens, man?
Yeah.
That's
so, man, it's been a real pleasure. Like, there's been a level of kind of what's the word?
Homoerotic energy.
That's exactly what I was looking for.
See, I'm diffusing. I'm diffusing the earnestness with humor right now. See,
there you go.
I'm the same.
Yeah, alignment is what I was going to say.
That's a good
sort of brother from another mother.
Yeah, absolutely, man. You're like the better British version of me with a cooler beard and more hair. And taller and smarter. All that said, I love it, man. So can't wait to talk again. We got to do this because post-pandemic,
it's dangerous.
We can shake hands.
I can't believe you're not wearing a mask, man.
You know what? I'm wearing one on my crotch because I'm worried about monkeypox.
There you go.
So the CDC said you can wear a mask about monkeypox, and I was like, well, where would I mask?
There you
the
go.
junk.
I should have told you before. I am actually riddled with monkeypox.
Oh no, but I could smell it.
Yeah.
I have a second sense about monkeypox. We never did talk about second selves, but we'll do it next time.
Yeah.
All right, guys.